Welcome to this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have Mark Bolton. He is a Gen Z expert, best-selling author, consultant, and speaker. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you, AJ. Pleasure to be here.
You're welcome to the show. You are welcome to India in this online form.
Yes,
and
great.
I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to discuss right now. We'll talk about Gen Z financial issues. Around that, we'll have our discussion. So when we are talking of Generation Z, Mark, I want to understand from your perspective, how do you see the situation of Generation Z in terms of finances? You have written a book also, we'll come to that. But first, your general observation about Gen Z and money. How are they dealing with money? Whether they are able to, they have money, they don't have money, you will be able to have a better idea.
So it's very interesting, AJ, because these are the young people who are currently aged between 11 and 26. That's the age group we're talking about. That saw in their lifetime. They saw, first of all, in the 2008-9 period, the Great Recession, which particularly affected the Western European and North American economies very badly. And then followed by that, not much more than a decade later, we have this global pandemic. And so in a fairly short lifetimes, they've seen two major financial shocks or economic shocks to their world. And a lot of the conclusions that they've drawn from that are that this is a state of being, that they should expect these kinds of economic shocks on a regular and cyclical basis, and that they need to be prepared to handle those kind of events. So that means they tend to be conservative in their financial approach. Despite their age, they're a lot more conservative than the generation before, the so-called millennials. They are conservative. They are also entrepreneurial, and they have certain traits in their behavior that are much more like what's in the US is called the Great Generation, which was the ones that saw the Great Depression of the 1930s. They behave in many ways like that. So that's a commonality that we're seeing across Gen Z or Gen Z. And it seems to be fairly global. It's very interesting because of the interconnectivity of digital technology and the ability to share ideas and concepts and concerns so quickly and easily globally. We actually notice a lot of similarities between Gen Z in India, China, the European Union, North America, that we didn't see so much in earlier generations when news didn't flow as fast and communications wasn't as integrated.
Right. So when we talk of Generation Z, then we talk about the age group between 8 to 26, if I understand correctly.
11 to 26.
11 to 26, yes. So,
yeah.
Obviously, 11-year-old person, individual will not have money. It can be only their dad's money, or until they have done something so big in terms of either being a creator or done some movies or anything. So
yes.
who is the one from this group who is, either in terms of having money from doing a job or something?
Yep.
How are they looking at it? And especially those people who do not earn but are looking towards that line, but they are using their, say, parents' money or inherited money, whatever they might be expecting. Yep. How do they look at money? Are these two, segments within the Gen Z looking at money differently or the same way, looking at jobs differently or the same way, or any other factor that you can point out for? Because a lot of people, the whole struggle for even marketers is to understand this generation, and there seem to be a lot of shift going on within this generation itself. So that's why, as a Gen Z expert, I want to understand it for people, individuals, small businesses, slightly higher level businesses, so that they can plan, stabilize or concretize some strategy in terms of dealing with this with this generation, because a lot of businesses are also online. In India, they've got millions of businesses who are trying to sell online, and because it's a global world, you are trying to reach out to customers, especially the young customers in different parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely, AJ. So, first of all, excuse me, we're not seeing a big difference between the youngest part of Gen Z and the older part. We tend to see a consistency of attitudes, approaches, values, behaviors across the generational age group. It's very interesting, just to answer the second part of the question about who's got the money. Well, clearly, as they move through their mid-teens and into late teens, they go through college, and so there's all of the expenses and that go with that. Or they may go into the workforce at 16 or 18. But for the ones that stay with college, for the first time, they're handling bank accounts and credit cards, typically funded by parents or savings, or in some jurisdictions, loans, which is a big challenge in the US is student loans. But they start to have money for the first time in their late teens. And then obviously at some point they move into the workforce, and that's when they start to earn. So predominantly the money that they do have is concentrated at the older end of the generation, as you'd expect, and it's predominantly from earnings at this point. They're too young to start really inheriting. That's the generation above. But once that process does start, and that's 10 to 15 years out from now, once that process does start, in most jurisdictions, most countries, there's more money to be inherited than ever before. More wealth has been created in the last few years, and that will cascade to this generation. So to bring this back to basics from a business perspective, it's incredibly important that businesses start to grab relationships and build relationships with Gen Z, because they do stand to not only be the highest income earners we've ever seen, they're also the biggest numerically as a group, also the biggest percentage of the major economies, US, China, India, EU. They're all about 20 to 21 to 26% of the economy. So building relationships and making them sticky to your brand or your business is really important. So let's talk about how do you do that. So I said at the start, one of the interesting features is that they're very entrepreneurial. They're very conservative. So be careful about that. They are conservative in some financial aspects and less conservative in others. And they're entrepreneurial, so they'll take risks. And the reason they'll do that is just harking back to what I said. They saw these two economic shocks. They really lost a lot of faith in either government or big business to take care of them. The concept, certainly in Western Europe and North America, of you got a job for life and you did that for 35, 40 years and retired, has largely gone. And this group saw it. Okay, this group see it in the media. They saw it with their parents. A lot of them lost their jobs in the Great Recession. And so that has vanished, and that safety net of big corporations will provide a career for us has gone. It's made them entrepreneurial. It's made them willing and able to take risks with small businesses, side hustles or gigs, whatever term you want to use, but something they do on the side, which can be a job or a business or a combination of the two. A lot of it digital. They're also digitally native. So if you're wanting to speak to this group, don't bother going anywhere other than through digital channels. And most companies recognize that today. But even if you were a bricks and mortar business, you're going to need a good online presence. It doesn't have to be wildly expensive or particularly complicated. You need to go to the places where Gen Z spend their time. TikTok is the predominant social media platform. I don't know enough about their business outside of the US, but certainly in the US, they're really growing that business. And they have a lot of programs to promote. They have TikTok Shop. They have various programs for promoting products. They work with affiliates. That's the meeting place. And the average Gen Z kid is spending about 4 to 6 hours a day on their smartphones, 2 of which are on TikTok alone. So TikTok gets a huge amount of attention. That's a key platform. Understanding that platform, being able to use it effectively, build an audience and drive engagement with Gen Z is going to be increasingly important. And I spend a lot of my time working with companies specifically around TikTok. Instagram is also important. Okay, it's a close number 2. But my prediction is that TikTok's growth rate is faster and it will accelerate Instagram. So those are the kind of platforms you need to be looking at. Then in terms of the messaging, it's very important to understand that, as I said, Gen Z are entrepreneurial. They like a limited level of risk, but they are thoughtful and they are thoughtful and engaged around risk management topics. So you can have conversations around them with them about risk if you're selling financial, for example, financial services. They also value authenticity. So the kind of advertising that would have worked a few years ago will not work, does not work well. And in fact, they're pretty resistant to advertising in general. So it does make life a bit more complicated for businesses that have traditionally relied on the advertising model, because now you're needing to work with influencers, you're needing to work with personalities, you're needing to build audience in a different way to look at your products, because Gen Z gets a lot of their product recommendations from influencers and from peers who are using or talking about these products on those platforms, particularly TikTok and Instagram. I've got a couple more things to say, and then I'll take a breath.
Carry on. I am listening to you, and that's very important for a lot of people to understand this whole new generation.
Yeah. So the authenticity part's really important. They can smell, excuse the phrase, BS very quickly and easily. They do not respond well to traditional types of advertising or anything that smells inauthentic. Now, the challenge for a lot of companies, particularly for bigger brands, is they have to take a long, hard look at the kinds of operations they have, the businesses that they're in, the product set that they have as well, to determine whether it aligns with Gen Z values. Because Gen Z will tend to buy, they're very driven by values. And certainly in North America and Europe, that's things like they're very concerned about climate change. They're very concerned about inequality, income inequality, and inequality in society. They're very concerned about diversity. That's a particular topic for the US more than Europe. But those three areas in particular drive a lot of their spending, and there is multiple reports showing that they will spend more on products that align with their values, and they will avoid products that don't align with their values. So it's important to put that into the marketing mix in terms of not just the messaging, but the messaging has to be supported by the products underneath, because if there's a misalignment, then that's inauthentic. That misalignment between the messaging, what we say, and what we do, they have to align. So those are some of the key takeaways. There's a bunch of other ones as well, but let me just pause there, AJ, to let you follow up.
Great points. Let's look at it from these points. These segments. One is the money part.
Yep.
Where do these people expect to get their money in terms of they start if they're getting a job? Yep. Many of them start, if it's in the US, many of them start with a student loan. What is that? So where will that get money? They get money. Will they get enough money to spend it on what? Second is job. You'd also talk about the rise of the side hustle. Yep. Now, that's the way it is. No, is that enough for a lifetime? Is that the beginning of something? And then later on, they will look at entrepreneurship. You talk there, they are very looking at entrepreneurship. But one thing I wanted to understand from you is that in the US, the boomers that the generation is facing this whole passing of wealth from one generation to another, the great wealth transfer that is happening at the moment. Yep. The problem there is there are no takers for earlier businesses. Why is it that the young generation, which is so entrepreneurial and looking at side hustles, is not wanting to take over the old businesses, which can be very easy for them to just take up and run it the way it is? So these things I do find a bit of a contrast in terms of the new generation. Why is it so? And will it mean that these businesses will close? High value businesses will close? The young generation will look at new ideas? What's wrong with the old businesses? In fact, if they like authenticity, then there you can find authenticity. A lot of people like traditional brands. What's wrong with that's why a lot of old brands can continue to be authentic and attract a lot. So how do that look like? So what is it that they want? What is it that they will continue to want from the market. Secondly, what is their attitude towards society? Sometime back, I recently did one interview with a person from the US Army. There, the problem is that a lot of Gen Z is not interested in the US armed forces. I
Yep.
had my own points of view, and they were trying to, understand this. I know they know the answers, but I guess they are not trying to find. In India, the situation is totally different. A lot of young people want to be in the army. In fact, there is a huge rush to join the army. So why is it so? What is it then it is? And is it going to this mindset? Because when you are in the age group of 11 to 26, Mark, you have a different mindset. Even I will, if I look backwards, my mind was a bit different. If this changes, and it certainly changes with time, what happens? So is this mindset going to stay the way it is because it is the first Gen Z in this? Will they turn into another generation which will be totally, hop up for a lot of marketers? How do you look? Several things here at the same time. Mark, you are the Gen Z expert. You know about these things. You have written a book on that. If you want to quote that in this answer, fine. Otherwise, I'll come to that also. But I want to understand this whole gamut of, comparison or contrast that I from my eyes see it. I want to understand it better for the audience.
Thank you, AJ. That's a multi-part question. I'm going to take it in reverse order. I think the first thing I'll just talk about briefly is how we think Gen Z will change over time, how Gen Z will change over time. So this gets into the world of futurism and crystal ball gazing, and what will they look like in 20 years? And of course, nobody really knows. There is evidence to suggest that as we age, we tend to get a little more conservative in our views, particularly around financial matters. And there's simple reason for that. When you're 13, 14, 15 years old, financial matters tend to be abstract. You're not handling them yourself. And suddenly you're into your 20s and 30s, and you've now got a household budget to run, and you've got loans to pay back, and you've got a job that doesn't pay quite enough, and you've got credit card bills, and you've got taxes at the end of all of that. So the simple practicalities of life tend to cause people to be a little bit more financially conservative over time. So no reason to think that that wouldn't happen with Gen Z. They start well, as I said, because of their formative years, seeing these economic shocks. I think they start from a good place. You read a lot. I have a big or growing following on both TikTok and Instagram, so I get a lot of feedback and comments, and I read a lot of what other people are saying within Gen Z, and also outside about Gen Z, and this inherent conservatism has put them in a place where they're prepared to work 2, 3, 4 jobs, which is the kind of the side hustle approach to life of having multiple incomes, so that they don't have what is called in risk management terms concentration risk around a single income. Okay, which is what it is. If you think about a job in one company, one income, you've got concentration risk. If that company goes away, you have no income. So they're very acutely aware of that. And that's one of the reasons that's driving this toe in the water with different businesses and side hustles and so on. And so they're likely to not only live more complex lives in terms of where they source their income from. I think that will probably be lifelong as well. I think that the idea of one job, one income, one source for extended periods it's not going to go away, but it's going to diminish as a proportion of the workforce that live that way. So I want to come to your second point, which is you're absolutely right. There are, in the US, I can talk to the US example particularly well, there are millions of boomers. So boomers are in their 60s now and they're retiring. And a lot of them have small businesses. And honestly, people are not buying these businesses. So they're ending up closing them down. And it's kind of like, well, somebody spent 20 years building a business. Why won't it sell? So a couple of interesting challenges. One is that a lot of the businesses that boomers have built are very traditional businesses. They're local economy based, they're tradesmen and service businesses. They're not necessarily businesses that Gen Z has a connection with, other than they may have seen particular trades in their home doing things, fixing plumbing or whatever it may be. They don't have a strong connection with those, and those businesses tend not to have a big digital footprint. So very often a progressive boomer who's a business owner might have a Facebook page, they might be on Marketplace, they might even have a little bit on Instagram, because if you're on Facebook, it's easy to post something on Instagram. But they probably don't have 250,000 followers on TikTok. And that's where that's where Gen Z is spending its time, not on Facebook Marketplace. So that lack of a digital footprint and that lack of a digital aspect to those businesses, I think, makes them less attractive to Gen Z. And then the second point is, boomers want paying for their businesses because they've created value over the years. There are cash flows there. There are gross and net profits, and they want to be paid for those businesses. Well, where does a 22-year-old come up with, $600,000 or $1 million to buy a business? Now, there are lots of business support programs in the US. It's a particularly rich economy for that. I'm actually originally from the UK. Haven't figured it out from my accent. I've been here nearly 20 years. And the small business support network here is incredibly good. But you still don't get past the hard fact that it's going to be very difficult for a relatively young and inexperienced person to borrow a large amount of money to buy a business, especially if they haven't worked in that business before. So it's interesting you bring that up, AJ. I hadn't thought about it, but there's the potential that there's a whole opening for a marketplace to help transition those businesses with education, support, capital loans. I mean, a whole bunch of stuff. But today that doesn't exist, I'll tell you. So the reality is those businesses they're dying. When boomers retire and there's no one to sell them to, they're closing them down and just doing an asset sale. And that value that they've created is gone. And of course, what happens is competitors then take up the customers. Your other point, I think, was around where are Gen Z getting their money from? And we talked a little bit about that in terms of them moving into the workforce and beginning to earn for the first time. But for example, the experience of going through college in the US can be incredibly expensive. There's a private and a public sector to colleges here, colleges and universities, and there's also tiers within that. And I know a lot of your viewers will know this already. So it's quite a complex, multi-tiered public and private market. You can, at the kind of the bottom left, which I guess would be that way here, you can at the bottom left sort of lowest tier, lowest cost, go to college and get a degree for $4,000 a year, $5,000 a year, those kinds of numbers, $3,000-$4,000 a year, sometimes even slightly less than that. And at the other end, you've got the private Ivy League schools where it's going to be $60,000, $80,000 a year, and everything in between. So there's a wide range of educational opportunities and costs here. People who want to go to one of the private schools, one of the Ivy League schools, as they call them, do a 4-year degree there, then you're looking at a $300,000 plus bill. So there's been some recent court cases which I'm not going to get into, but there's challenges around ordinary kids being able to do that. It's impossible. Where are you going to get $300,000 from if your father's just a regular working guy? So there is some challenges around how the smartest kids in society can get to the best schools, and that's a problem for the US. One of the ways is you go and borrow a hell of a lot of money and end up with hundreds of thousands of dollars of student debt. This particularly applies in the professions like medicine, so doctors, lawyers to some extent as well, but doctors are the best known case. Now, doctors have a high employment rate and typically high incomes, especially if they specialize. GPs, general practitioners, not so much. So you've got to be careful. If you borrow $300,000, get your medical degree, get your PhD in medicine, and then go into general practice, you could be paying that debt for a long time on quite relatively modest incomes. So there are certain challenges even for doctors, but for the rest of society, it's a big issue. And we know that outside of the US, this is not really the problem that it is for the US because the numbers here are so big. But 70% of students here have to borrow something to go to college. The 30% that don't are either top right, so they're rich parents going to an Ivy League school, or bottom left, which is they work a bar job or some kind of side job, and they pay their way because they're spending $3,000 a year on a local college. Everyone in the middle, the middle class, all get squeezed with loans. So so it's a very interesting and challenging marketplace for education in the US.
Absolutely, absolutely. And globally, how do you see it? Is it going to be the same everywhere, or because of the cultural differences, or you can say cultural difference on the way of living, people will look at it, will deal with this whole shift of the new generation taking over a bit differently? How do you see it happening in UK, Europe? Europe is a bit traditional,
Yep.
and even in a place like India, how do you perceive? How should the market perceive themselves? Where should they start building their footprint and or consolidating their footprint, because they have to look at into the future?
So AJ, it's very interesting. I have a social media company that I work with, and the team that I work most closely with is in India, and they're all Gen Z. Okay, and they're great. They're absolutely fantastic. I love working with these guys. They are smart. They are creative, and more than that, I see a lot of similarities between the way they think, the way they write, the way they behave, that I observe in the US. So I see a lot of, I do see a lot of similarities between Gen Z in India and the US in particular. There are different circumstantials, but a lot of the attitudes are the same. There's that same energy, creativity, thirst for authenticity, and entrepreneurial spirit, which is great, really healthy. So I do see a lot of similarities there. Europe, yes, Europe is a little more traditional, a little more traditional in the approach, and I think particularly in continental Europe, so the big EU countries, there's still a bit more of an adherence to the one job for life type of mentality, less so than ever. And as I said at the start, what happens today in Singapore is news instantly in New York or London or Tokyo or anywhere else. And people are watching the same influences, the same trends, the same videos simultaneously globally. So there's a strong crossover of ideas and concepts and behaviors, I think, across Gen Z globally. So Europe a little slower. The UK is somewhere between the two, I think, culturally. More entrepreneurial typically than continental Europe, less so than the US and India. So sits somewhere between the two. China, I'm less familiar with, and I'd like to spend more time doing research there. There's some interesting cultural things going on under Xi, and I don't want to get into the politics around it, but under President Xi, there's some interesting cultural things and some kind of, there's some interesting cultural things. I think there is a thirst for an entrepreneurial thirst in China that is currently not being met or not being allowed to express itself in quite the way that it would like. But again, I'm not going to get into the politics of it. So, but anyway, China's a very interesting case.
Right. Let's move on to the book.
Yes.
Your book that you have, the Gen Z Money Manual, Mastering Our New Economy. Tell us a bit more about this book. Who is this book for? Is it for the Gen Z or the market? And what is it that you have discussed in this book? One more thing I wanted to understand from you. You have mentioned fine in the book. Otherwise, just your final point is that a lot of this economy going forward is so much dependent online. Online is fine, but built around social media as such.
Yeah.
And out of these few platforms, you see the state of these major platforms as of today. Already, I was seeing some reports that the social media consumption has gone down from last year to this, and people are becoming more intentional, more focused.
Yes.
And as this goes by, even the Generation Z will become much more focused.
Yeah.
Then, how do you see a whole new generation predominantly living their life around businesses or thoughts or entrepreneurship online deals with this, suddenly a new sort of a contagion, catastrophic collapse, or whatever we may want to call it? Is it too much of a risk taking by one big generation which will be deciding about things?
Mm.
How do you see that? And in that context of the book, obviously you tell about that book separately if you have done this issue there. Even if not, I would like to you to address that.
Yeah, of course. I'm just making a quick note so I cover that. So I just checked. So this is the book. It's the Gen Z Money Manual. It's just so you can see it on Amazon. That's what it looks
Yes,
like.
right,
It's the Kindle hard copy and soft copy. I wrote the book because I did some work last year with a company to help a major US bank launch a credit card for Gen Z. And along with the credit card, they launched an app, and the app had community in it, and it had gamification in there, and it had some level of integration to social media. And the idea was that so this is something I'll talk about in a second. Gen Z are very, very good at curating products and concepts from the internet. They're very efficient at it in a way that, boomers will sit for a long time kind of scrolling through pages and looking at different things. Gen Z knows how to navigate to what they're looking for, quickly find the influencer or source of information that they trust that's reviewing the product or talking about the product, make a buying decision, and off they go. Now, so I'm jumping around here, but there's a few threads and thoughts in here that are really good, AJ. And one of them is you're absolutely right. Social media or total time spent on social media is actually dropping, and I think it will continue to do so a little bit. And I think Gen Z will be part of that drop because they're just better at curating the information that they need quicker and faster and have low tolerance for scrolling through basically piles and piles of commercials, advertisements, and all this other stuff that now clogs up all our social feeds. And I'm certain it's the same everywhere. It's 2/3 advertising products we're not interested in, 1/3 stuff that we actually care about, and that's at best. So I do agree that I think total social media interaction or time spent will continue to fall slightly. What Gen Z is then doing is for products that they really want to see and experience before making the purchasing decision, they're then going to retail, bricks and mortar retail, and then looking at the shoe or the clothing. And don't forget the age group; those are kind of key products in that age group: the shoe or the clothing or whatever it may be. And then making a purchasing decision when they get to the bricks and mortar store. So this is a bit like the internet 15 years ago, where nobody bought anything online. Everyone went online, had a look at this stuff, the pictures, the photographs, and then got in their car and drove to a store, right? Or got on a train and went to a store. It's going a bit like that again. But it doesn't mean we're not going back to there. I think it means a more integrated model for business where they have to have, as I was saying earlier, this really strong digital presence, but it has to be focused and targeted. And getting that right is really challenging. And working on the right platforms and the right influencers that then drives, if your product is not suitable for social commerce, in other words, commerce on the platform, then you have to drive them to your bricks and mortar business. There are a number of fashion brands who've figured this out already. Nike is one. I know Zara is another. And there's a couple of other ones I forget the names of that I've been reading about recently, where they've figured this out. And they don't really try to sell as much online as they were maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago. And they're now pushing people to go back to their high street stores and stores in the malls and other outlets for their products. And that's working for them. That's working well. So yeah, I agree. I completely agree with that trend. So I'm jumping around. I want to go back to the book for a second. So in answer to your question, I wrote the book for Gen Z, having done that piece of work around the credit card, and got very interested in what I saw with Gen Z, their attitudes and their thoughts, and so different from the generation before. And again, predominantly because of this experience of having two big economic shocks in their fairly short lifetime so far. And so I wrote the book to help them. I researched what are the biggest challenges that they face. The cost of living crisis is number one, particularly around housing, whether it's renting or buying. It's just in many economies, it's so expensive to get into your first home. You have to adopt all kinds of strategies that we used to adopt in the past: co-living, sharing, staying with parents longer. low start rental programs and purchase programs, all kinds of different strategies and techniques and approaches. So there's cost of living crisis it addresses. I talk about credit card management. I talk about basic budgeting, having a what's coming in, what's going out budget. And there's a ton of great tools that are online that help you do that integrate securely and safely with bank accounts and credit cards. So you can pull all your data in, you can see what you're spending on, you can start to manage and budget and forecast. Creating an emergency fund, which everyone should have as a priority. You should always have at least 3 months of expenses. It's not income, but expenses. Always have 3 months and ideally 6 or more as cash available to you for quick access. I talk about side hustles in the book extensively because I think that's really important in a growing area. How to select one, pros and cons. So I give a framework for identifying and selecting side hustles. What else do I cover? Student loans. That's a little bit specific to the US market, I will admit. And then right at the start, because I think it's one other thing, credit score management, which is very important in US, increasingly important in Europe and other economies. This whole credit score management issue is a big deal. If you have a poor credit score or little credit history, it becomes more expensive and challenging to get credit, but also certain other services. So in the US, other services are now linked to your credit score, such as if you want to rent an apartment, they will check your credit. If you are applying for insurances, car insurance, they will check your credit. Why? Because the actuaries have found that there is a link between low credit scores and high accident claim rates on auto insurance. So there's those kinds of, so having a high credit score, managing and looking after it is really important. So I talk about that. And the last thing I just want to mention, right at the start of the book, I talk about identifying your core values and setting goals that align with them. And this is a process I went through 30 years ago, and I don't go too deep into this, but I read an amazing book called Born to Succeed by an author called Colin Turner. Extremely practical. That was a point in my 30s where I wasn't sure which direction I was going. And it really helped me distill the essence of who I am and what really matters to me from a values perspective. There's a big process to go through, and I cover it in the book. And there's online tools as well that I provide. And then set some goals that absolutely align with those values, because goals that are not aligned to your values simply will not be strived for and you won't achieve them. So anyway, that's the first couple of chapters of the book. So yes, so there you go. That's a little walkthrough of the book. Last thing I want to say, just going back to social commerce, again, jumping around, and I apologize. TikTok in particular, I talked a bit about the platform. They have TikTok Shop. They are very, very focused on what is called social commerce and building that out. So they are really looking to grow the TikTok Shop into the Amazon of social media. And the difference between that and, say, Facebook is Facebook has Marketplace, which you can buy new products, but there's a lot of used products that people selling to each other. So it's a bit like, I don't know if you've ever experienced Craigslist 15 years ago, but Craigslist was people selling old fridges to other people, stuff like that. That's not what TikTok Shop is. TikTok Shop is all new products, new brands, and then closely integrated with everything that's going on the platform. And that is called social commerce. And that certainly TikTok is going to continue to drive. So I'll pause there. It's a lot of information.
Wonderful, wonderful. Lots of good information, Mark. And I wish I could, talk more, but then people won't be interested in, too much of talk. They would rather want to understand it. And if they have more questions, then they ask. And that is where, your book comes in. So show the book once again for the viewers, listeners, so that they can know which book it is that they would want to buy. And so, as I said, there's much to learn. And for that, they'll have to read this book. They'll have to come to you to learn. And for those people who would want to engage with you as a consultant, as your client, what is the best way for all these people to connect with you?
Yes, so I'm launching. So the book is obviously great, and you can work through the book, and it covers all of the key areas that I talked about. I am in the process of developing an online course, so that will be available some point early next year. We're still working through the materials to build that out, and that simply follows the book. So it covers everything from values and goal setting all the way through credit card debt, budgeting, and everything else. And there's a whole series of, as I said, there's online tools. I've got a series of about 12 spreadsheets that go with the book as well. They're already built. So we're bringing all that together. So for right now, it's the book, but next year there will be online learning as
well. Wonderful, wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, AJ.